The Trump administration reverses course on its new students' visa rule. It scrapped, ICE did, in fact, the directive after the government reached an agreement on a lawsuit filed by Harvard and MIT yesterday. The measure would have forced international students to transfer or leave the U.S. if their colleges hold classes entirely online this fall because of the coronavirus pandemic. CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez is joining us now to talk about this. So, Camilo, what do you know about the government's new decision?
It's good to be with you, Vlad and Anne-Marie. So earlier in July, the announcement by ICE fueled strong criticism from students, colleges, universities, and lawmakers, including some Republicans typically aligned with the White House. Institutions of higher education said the administration failed to consider the challenges of in-person classroom instruction during a global pandemic. And some of them sued the administration, like Harvard and MIT. And it was actually in that case in which the government agreed to yesterday to rescind this policy, which would have required foreign students looking to enroll in schools here in the U.S. that would only offer online and remote instruction in the fall to transfer to another school, leave the country, or face potential deportation.
Yeah, when I heard about that rule change, I thought to myself, you know, these international students pay way more than domestic students for the same education, and these institutions probably factor in that increased tuition in their bottom line, which is, you know, for a lot of schools, they're really suffering. So here you have 200 schools pulling together to threaten to sue the federal government over this. Have we ever seen a case like this before where so many institutions had pulled together?
That's a great question. There was some strong consensus among schools that this rule would harm them, and they mounted a pretty vocal campaign, as you mentioned, Anne-Marie, to oppose this rule. And they did this in a way that has really not been seen before. The only example that I can think of schools mounting a large-scale campaign against an immigration policy is the Trump administration's efforts to terminate the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or DACA, that President Obama instituted in 2012. Like DACA, you know, these proposed changes would have affected current and prospective students at these schools, and I think that played a big factor in this vocal campaign.
Camilo, it's hard for me to understand why this was even considered in the first place. The President of the United States and those in his administration have made a big point to say that they want the best and the brightest to come to this country. One would guess, I mean, I went to college and grad school, but I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I'm going to venture a guess that if you're coming here to go to an institute of higher learning, you are already considered at least one of your country's best and brightest if you have the money, if you have the wherewithal, if you have the ability to get to this country and to be able to study, and especially if you do it at one of our elite institutions, that would be what you would want to attract to this country. So can you explain to our audience why this was even considered in the first place?
Sure, and I think to answer that question, Vlad, we have to provide some context. So existing regulations that have been in place for 20 years generally prohibit foreign students or international students to only take online classes here in the US. That was the norm before the pandemic. But in March, ICE, recognizing that the pandemic poses unique challenges to classrooms and schools, said that these requirements would be suspended for the spring and summer semesters. Now, many people, including the schools, expected ICE to continue that suspension in the fall semester because the pandemic has yet to abate, and we've seen a surge in cases in many states. But ICE, in a stunning decision, said, no, we are going to go back to the regular rules, right, and require that foreign students take at least one in-person class in order to fulfill the requirements to be able to stay in the country.
Camilo, you know, was this less about sort of the realm that ICE is responsible for and more about pressuring these institutions to stay open, essentially, and not go to 100% virtual learning?
That is something that was actually cited in some of the 9 lawsuits that were filed in about a week and a half against this proposed change, plaintiffs cited the fact that officials like Acting Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Ken Cuccinelli, went on television and on radio outlets to say that these proposed changes would encourage schools to reopen in the fall, something that has been an important effort by President Trump and other administration officials who want to see schools open in the fall. So yes, that played a big factor in the litigation, but of course that litigation is now moot because the administration made this fast and really stunning reversal on an immigration policy, something that we really don't see often. And I think that speaks to the level of power, economic and political, that schools have in the country, but also to the level of familiarity that Americans have with international students, as opposed to, for example, border policy and immigration policy. Because the administration, as we've discussed previously, has made some sweeping restrictions during the pandemic, expelling asylum seekers and migrants at the border, restricting green cards and work visas, but this was the policy that elicited the biggest uproar.
You pointed out that ICE will revert to a directive from March. Can you explain how this directive will help students navigate student visa requirements amid the pandemic? Is it easier, is it harder, or just the same?
Well, it's easier, right? And ICE suspended it in March, a regulation that normally requires foreign students, international students, to take at least one in-person class during their semesters here in the U.S. Now they have more flexibility to participate in remote and online instruction, and this will benefit an approximately 1 million foreign students who attend U.S. universities every year. They make up about more than 5% of the student body here in the country, and this will give them greater flexibility in the meantime. But again, this is important to note that the announcement that was made earlier in July, Vlad, was guidance for an upcoming rule. That rule has not been published, so ICE is still expected to publish a formalized rule that could impact some potential international students, including those abroad who are not here in the U.S. and are looking to study here. That, I think, may elicit less outcry.
So we will be watching and waiting to find out what the formalized version of this turns out to be. Camilo, thank you so much.
Yes. Of course, thanks for having me.
All right.